Hello everyone, greetings from the Servant of Nero, AJ here, and it's occurred to me that I've been somewhat remiss with respect to covering certain pivotal and or generally more informative or world-building events and periods that might be of better use to actual newcomers to the world. Thus far, a lot has hinged on a great deal of assumed knowledge in previous presentations. Therefore, here is a summative study, because I can't think of any other way of putting it, of one of the most important events in Immoren's history. Perversely enough, it had comparatively little obvious effect on the parts of the setting that would become the Iron Kingdoms, use of that term strictly interpreted in this instance. However, this event was directly responsible for the forced evolution of one playable race, the cultural upheaval of another two, the dominant racial composition of a fourth, and, debatably, the indirect creation of the antecedents of four further factions, if all belonging to one race. Without this event, Immoren could have become vaguely unified, though this is a thoroughly debatable statement and not especially relevant to what is to be discussed as follows. To avoid its occurrence would be highly conditional to the point of being impossible to avoid. Needless to say, without this event and its effects, both immediate and long-term, War Machine and Hordes as we know it would have a very different factional composition. And with that said, commencing the events and consequences of the Cataclysm. The Cataclysm is a central but rarely discussed aspect of Iosan, and to a lesser extent Nis, lore and history. Ancestors of the Iosan people, the elves of the Empire of Lyos sought to bring the divine court onto Caen so that the gods of the elves could live among their worshippers. Using knowledge and understanding of the divine and arcane both, the elves set about the construction of the Great Bridge of Worlds. Quite why this was done will be the subject of another discussion. All that is relevant here is simply knowing that it was done. And for 250 or so years, the finest arcanists and craftsmen of the Empire laboured to make the plans of their gods a reality. Soaring into the sky, the Bridge of Worlds was a tower of unparalleled scale, metaphysically an arch spanning the chasm of dimensions. Within the bridge was a network of arcane generators of untold intricacy and complexity, the like of which none could even contemplate replicating ever again. Nevertheless, these labours saw fruition, and a junction was formed linking the bridge built from Nishil, the great capital in central Immoren, and the bridge built from the Palace of Lyos in the Veld. With a strange sense of haste, the Divine Court made the journey across, setting foot on the bridge and leaving the Veld behind. They made the transition across dimensions without incident, but when they left the bridge and arrived on Immoren, the unseen and unperceived flaws of the bridge, its anchor in the Veld, the junction between worlds, and its foundations in Nishil, they were all betrayed, and devastation like none could ever conceive struck. No words can reflect the truth of that fraction of a moment when Nishil abruptly ceased to exist. This event was the Cataclysm, and it is well named. The destruction wrought by the explosion of the Bridge of Worlds almost caused the elves of the Empire of Lyos to be utterly wiped out. A study of any reliable map of Immoren shows that the remains of this once great empire are few and far between, so thorough was the destruction, particularly within several hundred miles of where Nishil was, for where not even ruins exist. So complete was the annihilation of the once proud capital of the Lyossan people, the only clues of its existence are the unyielding sandstorms and unspeakable beasts that thrive within it, mocking the memory of what once was. Nothing could be salvaged from these stormlands that the Divine Court were able to rebuild or restore. To the land, though, the Cataclysm irreversibly changed the very nature of Immoren. Where there was once a lush, verdant land, as befit a thriving empire, nothing but dust and bones remained, becoming what has long been called the Bloodstone Desert. The great river Hilles, a waterway whose majesty was unparalleled as a natural wonder of the world, was sundered so deeply that the riverbed cracked open far towards the core of Caen, boiling away its waters and leaving behind the gaping maw of a chasm that would very quickly be known simply as the Abyss, a scar on the landscape of Immoren never to heal, into which light goes but does not escape, and across which no sane creature would wish to traverse. The waters of the seas around Cossar's Tears to the north and the Shattered Spine Islands to the south drain into the abyss, which consumes it all with a ravenous indifference. The Shattered Spine Islands themselves are a product of the Cataclysm, and fittingly named, for they, as part of the Alkier subcontinent, once formed a substantial part of the Immore's south. Elsewhere, the great lake that spanned an area covering much of the west of the empire was reduced to a dried plateau that has barely recovered since that time, now called the Bitter Sea. And throughout Immoren, earthquakes, storms, and unpredictable natural disasters afflicted all lands and all creatures for many years in the aftermath. The colossal explosion that destroyed countless cities had as little mercy on the people that built and dwelt within them. Millions once populated the great empire, and in an instant they were reduced to a pitiful fraction. All the survivors were from the fringes of the empire, those furthest removed from the affairs of Nishil and what was meant to transpire with the arrival of the divine court. The gods and goddesses saved those that they could, but the immediacy of the threat and their proximity to the epicenter weakened them greatly. Thus, because Nishil lay somewhat to the southeast, most survivors were found in the northern and western reaches of what remained. With few options, the Divine Court recovered their strength as quickly as they could and guided their people westward, settling in the temperate but still wild Mistbough forests that would become Ios, considering it a superior sanctuary for the shattered remains of their people. Some of the Lyossan remnant leaders wished to retreat further north to the forest of Rhylice, but the gods and goddesses counselled wisely against this move. Creatures of unknown danger could be found there, and it was a further and more perilous journey to reach that place, so the Divine Court chose the lands close to where the Dwarves of Rule had settled, and a tentative friendship developed between these two peoples. But the hearts of Iosans, as they would become, and whether they realized it or not, so many centuries hence, would ever be defined by the Cataclysm, and seem closed to any that know them as a people. That the population of Ios is not even 1 million in the modern era, despite the passing of more than 4,500 years, is testament to the destruction brought to its people. But the elves were not the only people to be brought to the brink of complete destruction by the Cataclysm. The giants, with whom the Lyossans shared central Immoren, lived close enough to the elven hinterlands to be caught in the blast. Despite their effective immortality and immense individual strength, the Cataclysm tore through the villages of the giants as the cities of the elves, and brought their once great population just as low. Out of some tens of thousands, barely a few hundred survived the Cataclysm, and they were isolated to the last remaining great city which became their capital, Benorth. A handful of villages further to the north also survived, but they, like Benorth, survived only because they were far from Nishil and nestled within the mountains of the Grinding Teeth Range. Countless Lyossan ruins to the west of these mountains attest to the reach of the Cataclysm's mercilessness. To the southeast, the Cataclysm brought upheaval also to the Scorn race. Though they were protected from the shockwave by the Shroudmold Mountains, they necessarily suffered many deprivations as they sheltered from the Cataclysm's immediate effects. And for the first time in their existence, the Scorn were settled and gathered in large numbers. This was a strange time for a nomadic people, but when they emerged from their caverns, it was a historic moment that came with the founding of the first permanent great city of the Scorn people, Malphas. They would be forever changed, for most of them would settle around Lake Mirketh, and while some Scorn ethnicities would remain nomadic, they would always be the minority. For the sake of the survival of the race, the Scorn had to build permanent shelters and rely on the strength of others as well as themselves, as Scorn tribes came together on an unprecedented level, and the first great houses were created. Among the first was House Kraltash, whose Dominar Kelskor gave Malphas its name. Though many traditions remained, born from the rivalry among the tribes, much of Scorn culture was irrevocably changed, and the expansion of Scorn urban society gave rise to common military disciplines, agrarian cultivation, and perhaps most impactful of all, the sorcerous arts centered in mortarthurgy. Mankind was influenced by the Cataclysm also, but as their diaspora was predominantly far to the southwest of the Empire of Laos, they were not so adversely affected. Part of the human population, however, lived to the east, many in the great city of Urus that lay tucked away in southern Immoren. That part of southern Immoren would become the Shattered Spine Islands, including what little remains of Urus, if it remains at all. The ruins of one of humanity's first cities is lost to historians and archaeologists, for even the descendants of Urus themselves disdained their own history. For where the Scorn bounded together within the Shroud Wall, the children of Urus fled beneath the aptly named Wall of Anguish and surrounding mountain ranges, while their world tore itself apart. They were scattered as the Shattered Spine was cleaved from the Immoren mainland. Some among the hardier survivors tried to venture into the Bloodstone Desert, but perished there in conditions that would make the desert's worst storms in modern times seem positively balmy. The rest ventured further into their underground catacombs, pondering their lot in existence, believing what had befallen them to be divine punishment. But when it did not end, their faith in Menoth faded with their sense of normal civilization, their society becoming more and more hive-like, strictly and brutally stratified, over centuries of evolution both biological and cultural, forced by their continued existence deep underground. Function and position became a product of intellect and ability that slowly evolved, along with a curiosity for nature, particularly the human brain, that was obsessive and profane. From their studies, experiments, and, one hesitates to say, innovations came Cephalomech, and with its spread, these once faithful followers of Menoth became the Cephalics. Most of the rest of humanity was saved, perhaps, from this fate, but even so they bore witness to the changes that the Cataclysm caused. To the west, the night sky lit up with an illumination that heralded times of hardship, visible to all eyes in western Immoren. The ancient chronicler, sage Angrand, would dub this the time of the burning sky. Ancient Ixthia, with Urus, one of the first cities of mankind, almost survived, but became uninhabitable amidst the natural disasters. From there, humanity ventured north and west, away from the source of the ill omens that the Cataclysm showed them. Indeed, a direct consequence of this time of the burning sky was the warlord era of mankind. Humanity had long since discovered the expanses of western Immoren that could be settled, thanks to the ancient warrior priest Belcor, whose followers accompanied him on an exodus north and west, almost 1,500 years before. But many died on their long odyssey to new lands, and the survivors, like the Cephalics, gave up their Menite faith, believing their god had abandoned them in their times of hardship. Their descendants, many of whom formed the Mulgar tribes, while others would found the Mordic realms, would come into conflict against the wave of migration from ancient Ixthia, spurred by the Cataclysm. Lastly, but certainly not least, was the effect on the dragons, or rather, a dragon, and what could potentially have happened to more of the others had they been caught. After the initial battle between Torok the Dragonfather and his progeny, they each retreated to their respective domains to lick their wounds. Though most stayed within western Immoren, some ventured towards the river Helles. While the movements of most around this time are not known, one was close by to the city of Gerlios when the Divine Court arrived on Immoren. Because this dragon was largely unknown to the peoples of the ancient world, no name for it has been recorded, and nothing is known except that it and the elves of the Empire of Lyos likely sought not to trouble each other if they did come into contact. We are, on the other hand, quite aware of its fate after the Cataclysm. As a dragon, it could withstand the energies released by the explosion and its aftermath, but the dragon's athank was forever warped, causing the creature that was its vessel to become something both draconic and not. The damage wrought to the athank was such that it caused this being to constantly change its physical form and to be forever tormented by the agonies of the abyss into which it fell as the river Helles ceased to exist. There it would remain, almost a myth to modern folk, called the Chimera by those few who know of its nature, or the Shapeless by those who rightly fear it. It is well that the Cataclysm occurred so long ago, and though current upheavals will no doubt leave their enduring marks on this land and the people that tend to it, it is unlikely that they will be anywhere so scarring or as far-reaching.